The scent of lilies and damp soil clung to Ivy's skin as she jolted awake, heart pounding. The dream still lingered in her mind, vivid and unervingly real. Grayson's voice echoed as if he had just spoken, his deep, assured tone wrapping around her like a memory rather than a fragment of sleep. They had been talking, about life, about things neither of them should know about each other. He had told her about his father's cold ambition, the weight of an empire pressing down on him. She had told him about the nights she had spent on the shop floor, calculating whether she could afford rent and fresh inventory in the same month. It was absurd. She didn't know him. He didn't know her. And yet, when she dreamed of him, it felt as though he was the only person who ever had. Ivy sat up, rubbing her eyes as Leo stirred beside her. He had crawled into her bed at some point in the night, his small form tucked against her side. Carefully, she shifted, pushing away the thick quilt, and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her tiny apartment was dim in the early morning light, the soft hum of the city just beginning beyond the window. The scent of old coffee lingered in the air from yesterday's rushed breakfast, mingling with the faint fragrance of the unsold flowers in the corner. She exhaled slowly. These dreams had been happening for weeks now. Every night, she and Grayson talked. Not just surface-level pleasantries, but deeply, as if they were two souls who had known each other forever. But they hadn't. He was a stranger. An impossibly wealthy, untouchable stranger, and she was a single mom with dirt permanently wedged beneath her fingernails from a life spent arranging bouquets and wrapping twine. She shook off the unsettling feeling and padded to the kitchen, flipping on the old coffee maker. The machine sputtered in protest, and she muttered under her breath, giving it a sharp tap. As it wheezed back to life, she leaned against the counter and tried to push the dream away. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't. Leo yawned as he wandered in, still in his pajamas, his curls sticking up in every direction. He rubbed his eyes and climbed onto one of the mismatched kitchen chairs. "Cereal," he mumbled, voice heavy with sleep. She tousled his hair, forcing a smile. "You got it, bud." Pouring cereal into a bowl, she let the mundane tasks of the morning ground her. Making breakfast. Packing Leo's school bag. Tying his sneakers while he wiggled impatiently. By the time she was ushering him toward the door, the dream had faded into the back of her mind, just another oddity in a life that had no space for such things. Then came the knock. She paused, one hand on Leo's jacket zipper, her stomach tightening. No one knocked on her door. Her landlord had learned she wouldn't answer if rent was due early, and deliveries never arrived this time of day. She glanced at Leo, his small face scrunching with curiosity, and told herself she was being ridiculous. She stepped to the door and cracked it open. And there he was. Grayson. Standing in the dim hallway of her apartment building, looking just as stunned as she felt. He was taller than she had imagined, though, really, she shouldn't have been imagining him at all. He wore a dark coat over a crisp suit, the kind of effortless wealth that felt entirely out of place against the peeling paint of her doorframe. His sharp blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She was still dreaming. She had to be. He exhaled sharply, barely above a whisper. "It's you." Ivy gripped the edge of the door to steady herself. Grayson took a half step forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something else, something almost desperate. "You remember, don't you?" She did. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Grayson lingers in the doorway, his eyes still wide with disbelief as the silence stretches between them like a fragile truce. Ivy, who has spent the last few minutes oscillating between shock and disbelief, slowly steps aside to allow him into her modest living room. They settle into mismatched chairs near the window, the soft light of early morning filtering through thin curtains. No one speaks at first, each is absorbed in the surreal notion that their nights have been shared in dreams, that memories of conversations they never had in waking life now echo in the stillness of a humble apartment. Ivy breaks the silence with a shaky laugh that sounds more like a question than a joke. "This is insane," she murmurs, her voice trembling with a mixture of wonder and anxiety. Grayson's gaze meets hers, and for a long moment, they simply search each other's eyes, as if expecting to find a hidden map to explain the inexplicable. Finally, he nods slowly. "I know," he replies, his tone low and thoughtful. "I've been trying to make sense of it all since last night." The room seems to hum with a quiet energy as they begin to probe the mystery. Grayson tilts his head, recalling the details that have haunted his sleep. "You mentioned a scent," he begins hesitantly. "Something like gardenia mixed with wet earth. Does that sound right?" Ivy's eyes widen, and a flicker of recognition crosses her face. "Yes," she answers softly. "It was the smell in my shop just before dusk. I remember it so clearly." Their shared recollection, as specific as it is uncanny, hangs in the air between them, a delicate thread of connection neither can quite explain. They start questioning each other, testing the boundaries of this strange overlap. "You said," Ivy ventures after a pause, "that you once lost someone very dear on a rainy night." I remember you mentioning something like that in my dreams." "Who was it?" Grayson's features tighten as he searches his memory, and then he nods slowly. "My older brother," he confides, his voice thick with unsaid sorrow. "I never really talked about it with anyone. It was a part of my past I kept locked away." Ivy leans forward, her interest piqued by the revelation. "I felt that pain," she admits, "even though I didn't know you. It was as if your grief was a part of my own story." The conversation meanders through fragments of dreams and half-remembered emotions. Grayson recalls the precise wording Ivy used when she spoke of her struggles, a phrase so intimate that it defies explanation. "You said you were battling every day just to keep your little world intact," he says, his tone softening with empathy. "It struck me deeply. I thought I was alone in carrying such burdens." Ivy's eyes glisten with a mix of vulnerability and cautious hope. "I was always afraid that my hardships were mine alone," she confesses, her voice barely above a whisper. "But hearing you say that, it makes this whole absurd situation seem almost comforting." As they continue, the details become more personal. Ivy mentions the faded photograph of her late mother that hangs crookedly in her shop, a detail Grayson recalls with surprising precision from his dream. "I remember the way your mother's eyes sparkled, even in that old photo," he remarks gently, as if he were describing a treasured secret. Ivy's breath catches, and she studies his face, searching for any hint of a lie. "How do you know about that?" she asks, her voice steady despite the tremor of disbelief. "I never told anyone," she adds quickly, almost as an afterthought. Grayson's answer is equally perplexing. "I didn't. It was all there, in the dream, every detail, every whispered memory." A long silence follows, punctuated only by the distant hum of city traffic and the occasional creak of the old building settling into its day. Ivy's thoughts whirl, and she feels the weight of a secret too large to bear, as if the dreams had opened a door to a past neither of them knew existed. Grayson, equally lost, wonders if these shared dreams are a sign, a cosmic joke, or perhaps a message meant to jolt him from his carefully constructed world of privilege and routine. "What are we supposed to do with this?" he finally asks, the question hanging in the charged air. His words are not a demand for an answer, but rather a reflection of the bewilderment that both of them feel. Ivy shakes her head slowly, a bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I don't know," she admits, her tone carrying both resignation and a spark of curiosity. "I just know that every time I close my eyes, I see you. And every time I wake up, I'm not sure if I should be relieved or terrified." Her admission is raw, unfiltered, an honest reflection of a woman who has faced far more tangible challenges in her everyday life than this surreal, inexplicable bond. Grayson reaches out tentatively, his hand hovering in the air as if to bridge the gap between dream and reality, yet he does not quite dare to touch hers. It is a moment suspended in uncertainty, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile connection they share. They begin to consider the possibility that these dreams might be more than mere coincidences, that perhaps there is a reason their subconscious minds have aligned so perfectly. They ponder whether the dreams could be a manifestation of unresolved desires, a blending of fears and hopes too overwhelming to articulate in waking life. But as they share their thoughts, the more the conversation reveals how little they truly understand about the forces at work. Each memory recalled and every detail confirmed only deepens the mystery, leaving them with more questions than answers. The coffee in Ivy's hands had gone cold, forgotten between sips as she stared across the table at Grayson. The weight of the morning still clung to them both, the strange and silent question hanging in the air, what now? They had already established that the dreams were real, or at least, real enough that they both remembered the same impossible details. But what did that mean? Where did they go from here? Grayson finally broke the silence, setting his untouched espresso on the table. If we're not losing our minds, he said carefully, as though testing out the words, then there has to be a reason for this. Ivy nodded slowly, watching the way his fingers tapped absently against the table, a restless movement that didn't fit his otherwise composed demeanor. You think retracing our steps will give us some kind of answer? His lips pressed into a thin line, as if he wasn't quite sure of that himself. It's worth trying. The problem was, their dreams weren't exactly logical. They didn't take place in a single, coherent location. Some nights, Ivy would be standing in a hotel lobby with a view of the ocean, the marble floor cool beneath her feet. Other times, she and Grayson would be sitting on the steps of a house she had never seen in real life, watching the streetlights flicker on at dusk. It was disjointed, fragments of memories that didn't belong to either of them. And yet, when she thought of them now, she could almost feel the air in those places, the way the breeze carried the scent of something familiar but unplaceable. They started at the park. It wasn't the exact one from the dreams, but it was close enough. Wrought iron benches, an old fountain at the center, children weaving between pigeons as parents trailed behind them, half distracted by their phones. Ivy wasn't sure what they were looking for. Some kind of déjà vu? A pull towards something they had missed before? They walked for nearly an hour, the conversation weaving between dream fragments and reality. Grayson told her about the last time he had been in a park like this, years ago, when business school felt suffocating and he needed an excuse to get lost for a few hours. Ivy told him about the way Leo always found a reason to collect sticks, pockets full of twigs he swore he needed to take home. It was easy, this kind of talking. They slipped into a rhythm that felt like something familiar, though neither of them could explain why. When nothing in the park sparked any recognition beyond the usual sense of nostalgia, they moved to the next place, an upscale hotel Grayson swore looked exactly like the one in their dreams. The lobby smelled of citrus and polished wood, and the quiet hum of conversation drifted through the air as businessmen checked in, their suitcases rolling softly against the marble. Ivy trailed her fingers along the edge of the reception desk, waiting for something, anything, to feel significant. Anything? Grayson asked, watching her carefully. She sighed, shaking her head. Just the overwhelming awareness that I do not belong here. He huffed a quiet laugh. Join the club. She gave him a look, taking in the expensive watch, the tailored coat, the ease with which he carried himself in a place like this. I highly doubt that. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. You'd be surprised. They lingered for a while, walking through the hallways, peering into the bar, stepping out onto the terrace to take in the city below. But there was no flicker of recognition, no sudden realization. Just a beautifully designed hotel and two people who were still grasping at an explanation. By the time they reached the cafe on the corner of 6th and Langley, Ivy was beginning to feel the weight of the day settle in. The cafe wasn't in any of their shared dreams, but they needed a break, and Grayson insisted the place had the best pastries in the city. She hadn't expected him to be the kind of person who knew about small cafes. He seemed like someone who had meetings in penthouses and ordered coffee from places that didn't even bother listing prices on the menu. But as he leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs in a way that made him look almost relaxed. She wondered how much of him she had already assumed rather than actually learned. "Let's try something else," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "Close your eyes." She raised an eyebrow. "If you think I'm falling for some billionaire hypnotism trick." He rolled his eyes. "Just trust me." After a beat, she sighed and did as he asked, letting her lashes flutter shut. "Think of the dreams," he said quietly. "Forget about logic. What do you remember?" "Not the big things, just details." She let herself sink into the memories, the way the air felt cooler in the dreams than in real life, the flickering neon sign outside a window, the smell of salt and something sweet. She thought of the way Grayson had always been there, not as a stranger, but as something steady, like a constant in a world that made no sense. Her brow furrowed. "A record player," she murmured, surprised by her own words. Grayson straightened slightly. "A record player?" She nodded, eyes still closed. "There was always music playing. Not from a speaker. From something old, something with scratches on the surface. It was in the background, but it was always there." She opened her eyes to find him watching her carefully, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "I remember it too," he said finally. "But I don't own a record player." "Do you?" She shook her head. They fell into silence, the hum of the cafe filling the space between them. They had spent the entire day searching, combing through places from their dreams, trying to find a missing thread that would unravel the mystery. And yet, they were still here, sitting across from each other, no closer to an answer than when they had started. Ivy sighed, pressing her fingers against her temples. "Well, that was thoroughly unhelpful." Grayson let out a soft chuckle, but there was something tired beneath it. "Maybe we're looking at this the wrong way," he admitted. "Maybe it's not about the places." She lifted her head, meeting his gaze. "Then what is it about?" He hesitated, as if he wasn't sure if he should say it out loud. Then, quietly, he said, "Maybe it's about us." She pushed her coffee cup aside, exhaling slowly. "Then I guess that's the next question," she murmured. "What do we do about us?" Grayson didn't have an answer. Neither did she. The alarm blared at 6:30 a.m., though Ivy had already been awake for a while. Sleep had been restless lately, not because of nightmares but because of something even more unnerving: silence. No dreams, no impossible conversations, no glimpses of a life that wasn't hers. Just the stark reality of her small apartment, the creak of the heating pipes, and the sound of Leo's steady breathing from the next room. It should have been a relief. Instead, it left an ache in her chest that she didn't have time to name. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, stretched, and forced herself up. Leo's door was slightly ajar, his tiny socked foot sticking out from under a blanket that had been kicked halfway off the bed. She leaned against the doorframe for a moment before stepping inside, smoothing his hair, and whispering, "Hey, bud, time to wake up." Leo groaned, burrowing deeper into his pillow. 5 more minutes. She grinned. "That's what you said yesterday, and you still ended up running down the street with your backpack open like a crazy person." His eyes cracked open. "I wasn't running like a crazy person," he mumbled. "I was running like a superhero." She pressed a quick kiss to his forehead. "Well, get up, superhero, or you're going to miss breakfast." Leo stretched dramatically before finally rolling out of bed, and Ivy left him to get ready. She moved through the kitchen on autopilot, pouring cereal, making coffee, packing his lunch. The same routine she had been doing for years. It felt comforting in a way, predictable, grounding. But even as she went through the motions, her mind kept drifting, reaching for something it shouldn't. By the time she walked Leo to school and opened the floral shop, she was determined to shake it off. Dreams weren't real. Responsibilities were. The tiny bell above the door jingled as she flipped the sign to open. The shop was small, tucked between a dry cleaner and a bakery that always smelled better than whatever sad sandwich she packed for lunch. Ivy had opened it 3 years ago with a mixture of ambition and blind faith, convinced that she could turn her passion into something sustainable. Most days, it barely scraped by. By the time she closed up shop and picked Leo up from school, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. He chattered happily beside her as they walked home, recounting details from his day, how he had beaten his friend in a race at recess, how his teacher said his drawing of a rocket ship was very creative, which he took as a polite way of saying it didn't look like a rocket ship at all. She nodded and laughed at the right moments, but part of her was distracted, thinking about the paperwork waiting for her at home, the emails she hadn't answered, the money she still needed to come up with. After dinner, after the dishes were washed and Leo was curled up on the couch watching cartoons, Ivy sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, staring at spreadsheets that refused to balance themselves. She was good at arranging flowers. She was less good at keeping a business afloat. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered looking up small business loans again, but she already knew what she'd find. More debt. More risk. She rubbed at her temples, then shut the laptop, pushing it aside. "You're making that face again," Leo said from the couch. She blinked. "What face?" "The one where you're thinking really hard about something not fun." She smiled, standing up and ruffling his curls as she walked by. "That's just called being a grown-up, kid." He scrunched his nose. "Sounds terrible." "It is," she said dryly. "Never grow up." She sat down beside him, letting the sounds of the TV fill the space. She wasn't going to fix everything in one night. Tomorrow, she'd open the shop again, she'd sell more flowers, she'd figure it out. That's what she did. She figured things out. And yet, as she sat there, letting herself relax for the first time all day, a thought crept in, uninvited, unwelcome. What if Grayson walked through the door right now? She shook her head, as if physically trying to rid herself of the idea. It didn't matter. He wasn't going to. He had his life, and she had hers. The dreams, the connection, whatever it was, it didn't belong here. It didn't belong in the reality of late nights balancing finances, early mornings making sure Leo brushed his teeth, long days trying to keep a business alive. She forced herself to let it go. But even as she sat there, watching cartoons with her son, she knew it wasn't gone completely. Because no matter how much she tried to convince herself that dreams didn't matter, she still caught herself glancing over her shoulder, waiting for something, or someone, who wasn't supposed to exist in her world at all. Grayson sat at the head of an impossibly long dining table, listening to the familiar drone of his father's voice while his mother meticulously cut her fillet into perfect, identical pieces. Across from him, Isabella sat poised, her back straight, her hands resting delicately on her lap, like she had been trained to be a museum exhibit rather than a person. Every detail of the evening was curated, the lighting just dim enough to be flattering, the wine selected months in advance, the menu dictated by whatever Michelin-starred chef his parents had flown in this week. His father, Charles Westcott III, had a way of speaking that felt less like a conversation and more like a presentation. He didn't expect participation, only quiet nods and the occasional murmured agreement. "Isabella's family has been in discussions with the board," he said, dabbing the corner of his mouth with a linen napkin. "A merger like this would secure our holdings in Europe. Their influence in Paris alone." Grayson took a sip of his wine, barely listening. He already knew how the conversation would end. It always ended the same way, with the reminder that it wasn't just expected, but necessary, that he and Isabella formalize their engagement. He was 29, after all. His father had been married at 25, his grandfather at 22. He was past due. His mother, Eleanor, smiled in that particular way that made it clear she had already decided how this would play out. "We don't want to pressure you, darling," she said, though that was exactly what she was doing. "But you and Isabella have known each other since childhood. It just makes sense." It made sense in the way a business transaction made sense. It was clean, strategic, beneficial, and entirely devoid of anything resembling real emotion. Isabella knew it too. She was beautiful in a way that looked effortless, but Grayson suspected it wasn't. Everything about her was careful, her words, her expressions, the slight tilt of her chin when she wanted to appear interested but not eager. She wasn't unkind, but she wasn't particularly warm either. She had been raised for this life, just as he had. Of course, Isabella said smoothly, twirling the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. But these things take time. No need to rush. It was her way of playing along while leaving the door open for escape, just in case something better came along. Grayson almost admired it. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie slightly. "You'll have to forgive me if I don't jump at the chance to let a boardroom decide my personal life." His father sighed, a barely restrained flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Grayson, we all have obligations. You don't get to opt out just because you feel like it." His mother pressed a hand against his father's arm, as if to remind him to remain civil. "All we're saying, darling, is that we want you to be happy." Grayson nearly laughed. Happy? The word felt so absurd in this setting, where happiness was measured in successful deals and acquisitions. But then again, what did he know about real happiness? His entire life had been scripted from the beginning. Elite boarding schools, Ivy League degrees, summer internships that were really just rehearsals for the life he was meant to lead. There had never been a question of what he wanted. Only what was expected. By the time dessert was served, he had given up on arguing. It wouldn't make a difference. His father would continue pressuring, his mother would continue pretending she wasn't, and Isabella would continue waiting to see if he was worth the trouble. It was all so predictable. What wasn't predictable, however, was Ivy. Later that night, after he had escaped the endless conversations about stock options and market expansions, he stood in front of the massive windows of his penthouse, staring at the city below. The skyline was lit up in gold and white, stretching endlessly into the horizon, but he wasn't really seeing any of it. His mind was elsewhere. She was elsewhere. Ivy. She was not polished or rehearsed or carefully constructed to fit into the world he knew. She was all untamed curls and ink-stained fingers, a woman who smelled of fresh-cut stems and the kind of hard work that left a person exhausted but satisfied. She was stubborn in a way that wasn't meant to manipulate. She was tired in a way that came from real struggle, not manufactured stress. And she was in his head when she had no business being there. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for sleep. But he already knew what would happen. She would be waiting for him in his dreams, just as she had been every night. When he dreamed, it wasn't of board meetings or hotel expansions. It wasn't of arranged engagements or family obligations. It was of Ivy standing in her floral shop, her hands buried in a bouquet of peonies, looking up at him like he was an anomaly she hadn't quite figured out yet. It was of her voice, laughing at something he had said, a sound that felt real in a way most things in his life didn't. It was of her glancing at him through the cafe window, her face half hidden behind a coffee cup, eyes filled with something he couldn't name. It made no sense. She didn't belong in his world. And he certainly didn't belong in hers. But every night, she was there. And every morning, he woke up feeling like he had lost something he had never even had. Ivy was in the middle of wrapping a bouquet when the doorbell chimed, sending a soft jingle through the quiet shop. She didn't look up right away, her hands were busy tying twine around the stems, and she had promised Mrs. Bellamy that her anniversary flowers would be ready by noon. "Be right with you," she called out, her fingers tugging the knot into place. The moment she glanced up, she regretted it. Grayson stood in the doorway, looking as out of place in her shop as a diamond ring in a thrift store. He was wearing another one of his expensive coats, the kind that looked like it had never touched a speck of dust, let alone seen the inside of a city bus. His eyes locked onto hers, unreadable and intent, and suddenly, the tiny shop felt much too small. She exhaled through her nose, setting the bouquet on the counter. I don't remember putting Billionaire Existential Crisis Counselor on my business card. Grayson didn't react to the joke. He stepped further inside, his presence shifting the energy of the room, filling it with something heavy and unspoken. We need to talk. Ivy crossed her arms, leveling him with a look. No, we don't. Ivy. He said her name like it was the beginning and end of his argument, like it carried the weight of everything neither of them had figured out yet. She sighed, glancing at the clock. If this is about the dreams, I already told you, I don't have an answer. She gestured around the shop. I have a business to run. A kid to feed. I can't spend my time worrying about why some rich guy keeps popping up in my subconscious. Grayson's jaw tightened. He had clearly rehearsed whatever he came here to say, but she was throwing him off. He rubbed a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. It's not just the dreams. Something in his tone made her hesitate. There was an urgency she hadn't heard before, something close to desperation lurking beneath the composed exterior. She waited. Grayson stared at the floor for a beat before finally lifting his gaze back to hers. I'm engaged. The words dropped between them like a stone, but Ivy just blinked at him. Okay? He studied her, as if expecting a bigger reaction. When she didn't offer one, he ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before turning back to her. I'm engaged to Isabella, my parents have been pushing for it for years. It's expected. She frowned, shifting her weight. That sounds like a you problem. He let out a breath, shaking his head. I thought I could go through with it. I thought I could just ignore everything else. But every night, I see you. Something in her stomach twisted, but she ignored it. She shook her head, forcing a laugh. Grayson. You're in my head, Ivy. His voice was sharp, like he was losing patience, but not with her, with himself. I wake up, and it's like I've left something unfinished. Like I should be somewhere else. With you. The air between them stretched thin, filled with things neither of them knew how to name. Then Ivy did what she always did when something became too much. She laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, but it wasn't kind either. It was the kind of laugh that came from sheer disbelief, from a life spent dealing with things much more tangible than a man who had too many options and was somehow still making himself miserable. Grayson's expression darkened. You think this is funny? I think this is ridiculous, she corrected, shaking her head. You're a grown man. You have more money than most small countries. If you don't want to marry someone, don't marry them. He ran a hand down his face again, like he was barely keeping it together. It's not that simple. It is that simple, she countered. You're acting like some tragic hero in a romance novel. Meanwhile, I have to figure out how to pay my electric bill before they cut the power. Forgive me if your engagement drama isn't at the top of my priority list. Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at her like she was the only person who had ever spoken to him like this, which, given his life, was probably true. She sighed, shaking her head. Look, I don't know what's happening between us. I don't know why you keep showing up in my dreams, and frankly, I don't care. I have enough real problems to deal with. If you don't want to marry Isabella, don't. But that's your decision, not mine. He was silent for a long moment. Then, with something that looked like defeat flickering across his face, he nodded once. I get it. Good, she said, though it didn't feel good at all. Grayson looked at her one last time before stepping back toward the door. He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else, but in the end, he just nodded again and walked out. The bell jingled softly as the door shut behind him. Ivy was elbow deep in a bucket of water, scrubbing dirt off her hands after rearranging a particularly stubborn display of hydrangeas, when the bell above the shop door chimed again. She sighed. It had been a long day, and she was about 10 minutes away from locking up. She turned, expecting to see a last-minute customer looking for an apology bouquet. Instead, she found Grayson Westcott standing in her doorway like he belonged there. She groaned. No. Grayson arched an eyebrow. I haven't said anything yet. I don't need to hear it, she said, grabbing a towel to dry her hands. If this is another dramatic speech about fate or how I've ruined your engagement, I'm not interested. He stepped further inside, ignoring her. I'm not here to talk about Isabella. Fantastic. She gestured toward the door. See you never. He didn't move. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his absurdly expensive coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter between them. This is how much money I'm offering you. She stared at it. Then at him. Then back at the paper. Excuse me? He exhaled, rubbing a hand along his jaw, looking like a man who had debated this decision long and hard before walking through her door. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not here to convince you of anything. But I can't just walk away from this without knowing why it's happening. She crossed her arms. And you think money is the answer? I think money is the only reason you'd agree to help me, he said plainly. You have bills. A business to run. A kid to take care of. Let me make that easier for you. 1 year. I'll cover all of it. In exchange, you help me figure this out. She gaped at him. You want to hire me to solve our shared sleep disorder? He didn't blink. Yes. She looked at the paper again. Ivy wasn't a fool. She knew that whatever number was written there would be enough to keep her shop afloat, enough to take Leo on a vacation, enough to buy some breathing room for once in her life. She also knew that taking money from Grayson Westcott was probably the worst idea she'd ever had. Her fingers tapped against the counter. This is insane. I know. She studied him, trying to find the catch. Why me? You could hire 100 people to dig into this. He held her gaze. Because you're the only other person who understands what this feels like. Her stomach twisted. Because he was right. She had spent weeks trying to ignore it, but it was there, every night. The dreams. The conversations. The feeling that something about her life had shifted, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't put it back the way it was. She let out a breath. Fine, she said, grabbing the paper and shoving it in her pocket before she could change her mind. But just so we're clear, this is not some weird, romantic fate nonsense. This is business. Grayson's lips twitched. Of course. She pointed a finger at him. No dramatic confessions. No long, brooding stares. No. Ivy, he cut in, smirking. You're on my payroll now. You can stop lecturing me. She threw her hands in the air. This is already a mistake. Their first stop was a therapist's office, where Ivy sat awkwardly in a chair that was just slightly too comfortable, facing a woman with a warm, practiced smile. Grayson looked much more at ease, sitting beside her in his usual tailored suit, legs crossed like he was in a board meeting. The therapist listened patiently as they explained their situation, nodding thoughtfully as she jotted down notes. When they finished, she folded her hands in her lap. It sounds like what you're experiencing is a manifestation of unresolved emotions. Ivy blinked. I'm sorry. The therapist nodded, as if this were obvious. Often, when two people find themselves repeatedly dreaming about one another, it's a reflection of something their subconscious is trying to process. Attraction, avoidance, past connections. Ivy snorted. Trust me, there's no past connection. Grayson tilted his head slightly. And no attraction? She glared at him. Don't start. The therapist smiled patiently. I suggest keeping dream journals. Pay attention to patterns. And, if possible, work through any lingering emotional conflicts between you. Grayson frowned. That's it? The therapist spread her hands. Dreams are a tool, not a mystery to be solved. Ivy stood. All right, this was fun. Let's go. Their second stop was a church. Ivy wasn't particularly religious, and judging by the way Grayson lingered near the entrance, neither was he. But desperate times and all that. A priest greeted them in the dimly lit chapel, his expression kind but unreadable as he listened to their story. When they finished, he took a long breath. There are things in this world that are beyond understanding, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Some doors should not be opened. Ivy frowned. So, what, we just ignore it? The priest nodded. Perhaps it is not meant to be understood. Grayson pressed his lips together. That's not really an answer. It is the only one I have, the priest said simply. As they walked back to the car, Ivy sighed. Well, that was ominous. Grayson looked frustrated. And useless. She patted his arm. Maybe fate is telling you to take the hint. Their last stop was a psychic shop tucked between a laundromat and a nail salon. The neon sign in the window blinked, palm readings, $20, in a tired, flickering glow. Ivy smirked. This should be good. Inside, the air smelled like incense and something vaguely floral. A woman draped in scarves sat behind a table, her fingers covered in rings. She waved them forward, already smiling. Ah, she said. You too. Grayson stiffened. You know us? The woman laughed. I know your type. Ivy dropped into a chair. Great. Tell us why we're sharing dreams. The woman studied them, then reached for a deck of tarot cards. She shuffled them, then turned over a single one. The lovers. Ivy groaned. Of course. The woman tapped the card. You are bound. Grayson's jaw tightened. Bound how? Fated, she said simply. Ivy leaned forward. Yeah, see, that's not gonna work for me. Can you unfate us? The psychic smiled. Fate does not work that way. Grayson exhaled sharply, standing. Thank you for your time. As they left, Ivy glanced at him. So, what's the takeaway? He rubbed a hand down his face. That we just spent an entire day learning absolutely nothing. She patted his back. Welcome to my life. He shot her a look, and she grinned. Maybe this deal wasn't going to be so bad after all. Ivy had never spent this much time with a man who owned cufflinks. She was fairly certain Grayson had never spent this much time with a woman who used the phrase, buy one get one free, as a survival tactic. Yet, somehow, they kept ending up in the same places, sitting across from each other, bickering over coffee orders or debating the merits of discount grocery stores versus personal chefs. It had been a week since they struck their strange deal, and despite herself, Ivy was starting to enjoy his company. It started with the small things. Like how he always ordered black coffee but dumped in an unreasonable amount of sugar when he thought no one was looking. Or how he was weirdly knowledgeable about random facts, why hydrangeas changed color, the best way to remove a red wine stain, the precise temperature at which chocolate melts. He wasn't stuffy all the time, just most of the time, and when he let his guard down, Ivy found herself wondering how someone born into so much privilege could still seem lost. Grayson was just as fascinated by her. He marveled at the way she stretched every dollar, how she could fix a broken flour cooler with duct tape and sheer willpower. He had never met someone who worked this hard for something so uncertain. It confused him. Impressed him. Terrified him. They sat on a park bench one afternoon, an untouched bag of pastries between them. Ivy had been talking about Leo, about the impossible mix of exhaustion and joy that came with raising a kid alone. You think you know love, she said, staring at a group of children chasing each other across the grass. And then you have a baby, and suddenly, it's not about you anymore. Ever. She turned to him, lips quirking into something wry. It's like having a tiny, adorable dictator who doesn't let you sleep. Grayson watched her, elbows resting on his knees. And you did it alone. She shrugged. Not by choice, but yeah. He hesitated, then asked something he hadn't dared to before. Where is Leo's father? Not here. Her voice was even, but something flickered in her eyes. He wasn't ready for it. Or maybe he just didn't want to be. Either way, I don't spend time worrying about people who leave. Grayson's fingers drummed against his knee. That's unfair. Ivy let out a short laugh. You don't have to sugarcoat it. It sucked. But I don't have the luxury of falling apart over it. His brow furrowed. Luxury? Yeah. She gestured vaguely. Crying about heartbreak and betrayal? That's for people who have time. I have a kid to raise, a business to keep afloat, bills to pay. She tilted her head. Besides, the reality is, I didn't lose anything. Leo did. And I have to make sure he never feels that. Grayson had never considered resilience as something someone was forced into. In his world, difficulties were softened by financial safety nets, by reputation, by well-placed connections. If something broke, it could be replaced. If something was lost, it could be bought back. But Ivy had built her life out of things that couldn't be replaced. He wasn't sure if he admired it or if it just made him feel like an overpaid idiot. Later that night, over drinks, Ivy turned the tables. So, she said, stirring the ice in her glass. Tell me about the gilded cage. Grayson sighed, leaning back in his chair. Where do I start? At the part where you have everything but still look like you hate your life. He let out a short laugh. You don't hold back, do you? She smirked. Not in my price range. He ran a hand over his face. It's not that I hate my life. It's just, never really been mine. Ivy frowned. That's dramatic, even for you. He tapped his glass, thinking. My family doesn't ask what I want. They tell me what I want. They shape it. Mold it into something that fits their version of me. He exhaled. It's suffocating. She considered that, then nodded. I can see that. His eyebrows lifted. You can? Yeah. I mean, I can't relate, but I get it. She swirled her drink. I don't have the luxury of being what people expect. I have to be what's necessary. And I guess, in a weird way, that's what you are too. His lips parted slightly, like he had never thought of it that way. She tilted her head. So what do you want? If you could do anything? He hesitated, then shrugged. I have no idea. She let out a low whistle. That's tragic. He smirked. I know. The more they talked, the stranger it became. The connection. The ease. They should have had nothing in common, and yet, in some ways, they understood each other better than anyone else ever had. Ivy had never known luxury, and Grayson had never known struggle, but both of them had spent their entire lives being shaped by forces outside their control. She by circumstance. He by expectation. Ivy was lying on the couch in her shop, staring at the ceiling, tossing a flower stem between her fingers. Across from her, Grayson sat in the chair he had unofficially claimed over the past few weeks, flipping through a book on dream psychology he had picked up from some overpriced bookstore uptown. This is useless, she muttered, pressing the flower stem against her forehead dramatically. I'm running out of patience, and worse, I'm running out of ways to make fun of you. Grayson didn't look up from his book. You're saying your material is drying up? I'm saying I'm dangerously close to taking this whole thing seriously. She sighed, sitting up. Which means we need a new approach. Grayson glanced at her. Such as? She tapped her fingers on her knee, thinking. We've spent all this time trying to find some deep, psychological explanation. But what if we're missing something simple? He shut the book. Like an actual connection, she said, watching him carefully. Something we've both forgotten. A moment, a place, an intersection of our lives before this whole dream thing started. He frowned. You think we met before? She shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. But we've checked everything except the most obvious thing of all, where we come from. He leaned back, considering it. So you want to visit each other's hometowns? She threw her hands up. Why not? Maybe there's something there we don't remember. A person, a place. Maybe your childhood home is built on a secret portal, and this is all just a very elaborate ghost story. His lips twitched. Now you're just hoping for something dramatic. I mean, if we're gonna be cursed, I'd at least like a compelling backstory. Grayson stared at her for a moment, then exhaled. Fine. Fine. Fine, he repeated, standing up and brushing invisible dust from his perfectly pressed sleeves. But we start with my hometown. If nothing comes from it, you owe me a drink. She grinned. Deal. They arrived at the Westcott estate late the next morning, and if Ivy had thought Grayson's usual level of wealth was overwhelming, this was something else entirely. The house, no, the mansion, stood on a ridiculous stretch of land, surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges and fountains that probably cost more than her entire business. The driveway alone looked like it had been designed for royalty, winding its way up to the massive stone entrance. She let out a low whistle. I take back everything I said. You're definitely a prince in exile. Grayson rolled his eyes but didn't argue. He led her inside, where the ceilings were so high she was convinced they had their own weather system. Everything gleamed, marble floors, chandeliers, furniture that looked too expensive to sit on. A staff member walked by, offering a polite nod to Grayson before disappearing down a hallway. Ivy blinked. Do you even know that person's name? Of course I do. She arched a brow. I think it's Robert. Ivy snorted. He led her through the house, past formal dining rooms and sitting areas that had probably never been sat in. He took her to his old bedroom, now an unused guest suite, then to the library, then to the gardens. Nothing sparked recognition. Nothing felt familiar to her. After hours of searching, they sat on the edge of the massive fountain in the courtyard, eating sandwiches prepared by a chef who had appeared, ghost-like, at Grayson's request. Ivy sighed. I'm gonna say it. This was a bust. Grayson ran a hand through his hair. I know. No secret portals, no eerie childhood paintings, no long-lost twin brothers. She took a bite of her sandwich. Disappointing. He gave her a dry look. Should we just give up? She chewed thoughtfully. Not yet. My turn. Her hometown was 3 hours away, a small town that felt impossibly far from the glass skyscrapers and high-end luxury of Grayson's world. The moment they drove in, Ivy's shoulders relaxed in a way she hadn't realized they were tense. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, the kind that had been repainted so many times you could still see traces of the original colors underneath. A diner sat on the corner, the same one where she had spent too many teenage nights drinking milkshakes and dreaming of escape. The bookstore still had the crooked sign her mother used to joke about fixing but never did. Grayson glanced at her. You miss it? She hesitated. Sometimes. It didn't take long to realize that Ivy's town had even fewer answers than Grayson's estate. They walked through the streets, stopping in front of her childhood home, a small, cozy house with a porch swing that had seen better days. She pointed out places from her past, the field where she learned how to ride a bike, the alley behind the grocery store where she had her first kiss, the school where she had spent more time daydreaming than studying. Nothing. No sudden connections. No strange déjà vu. Grayson was quiet as they made their way toward the old community college, where Ivy had taken a handful of classes before Leo came along and changed everything. They walked through the campus, past the courtyard where students were scattered on benches, past the library, past the old auditorium. Ivy sighed. This was a terrible idea. Grayson was about to agree. And then he stopped. Ivy turned to him. What? His expression had gone rigid, his posture tense. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the steps of the auditorium. His breathing had changed. I've been here before, he said, voice distant. Ivy frowned. Yeah, we've been walking around for an hour. No, he cut in, shaking his head. I mean before. Years ago. She blinked. When? He swallowed. Graduation. A friend of mine had a cousin who was graduating from a community college, and we got dragged along. Her stomach tightened. My community college? He didn't respond right away. He was staring at the auditorium entrance like it held something he hadn't been able to see before. Ivy stepped closer. Grayson. Slowly, he turned to face her. You were here, he said. The same day I was. Something settled in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. A piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Grayson stood frozen on the steps of the old auditorium, his pulse hammering in his ears. The smell of freshly cut grass, the faint echo of laughter, the warm weight of a summer afternoon, it all came back in sharp, vivid detail. He had been here. Years ago. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts a mess of half-formed memories. The stage. Rows of folding chairs. The hum of excitement and the rustling of graduation gowns. A friend nudging him, complaining about the heat. His father's impatient sighs, his mother checking her watch. He hadn't even wanted to be there, had barely paid attention to the ceremony, too preoccupied with the weekend trip to Nantucket that was waiting on the other side of it. But now, standing in the same spot all these years later, he knew. I was here, he said, his voice quiet but certain. Ivy stood a few steps below him, arms crossed, skepticism written all over her face. Yeah, you mentioned that already. No, he shook his head, turning to look at her. I mean, I was here. The day you graduated. She frowned. How would you even? I was dragged to some cousin's graduation, he interrupted, piecing it together as he spoke. My friend James. His cousin was in the class of, what year was yours? 8 years ago, Ivy said slowly. Grayson exhaled sharply. That's it. That's the one. Ivy stared at him, the wheels in her head turning. So, we were in the same place. But that doesn't mean anything. Grayson gave her a look. You really don't think it means anything? She hesitated. They had spent so much time searching for some elaborate explanation, past lives, cosmic interference, some mysterious force beyond their understanding. But what if it wasn't complicated at all? A single moment, barely noticed at the time, lodged in the back of his mind. A memory that had slipped past conscious thought, buried under years of obligations and expectations, only to resurface in his dreams like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Ivy exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. This is ridiculous. Grayson let out a short laugh. You keep saying that. Because it is. He smirked. And yet, here we are. She groaned. So what? You saw me once at my graduation, and now we've been cosmically linked ever since. That's what we're going with? He shrugged. Stranger things have happened. She shot him a look. Name one. He had nothing. Still, neither of them could deny the feeling creeping into their bones, the unshakable sense that they had finally stumbled onto something real. A moment. A connection. The beginning of something neither of them had realized had started years ago. For the first time since this entire thing began, the weight of uncertainty lifted, just a little. Grayson let out a slow breath. I think we found our answer. Ivy didn't say anything right away. Grayson stared at the ceiling of his penthouse, his hands resting behind his head, the city lights casting long shadows against the walls. It had been 2 days since he and Ivy had stood in front of that auditorium, 2 days since they had realized they had crossed paths long before the dream started. And yet, the dreams hadn't stopped. Every night, they were still there. The conversations. The way she looked at him like he wasn't just a product of his upbringing, like he was someone worth knowing beyond his last name. It wasn't fading. If anything, the connection felt stronger, like now that they had opened this door, neither of them knew how to close it. By the time he called Ivy, he wasn't sure what he expected. She answered on the third ring, sounding exhausted. Let me guess. Still dreaming? He pinched the bridge of his nose. Every night. Same. There was a pause, then a sigh. So, what now? Grayson exhaled, pushing himself up from the bed. That's what I was hoping you could tell me. A rustling sound came through the phone. She was probably at her shop, rearranging bouquets or fixing something with duct tape and sheer willpower. Okay, she said slowly, thinking. What if we were supposed to meet that day? Grayson frowned. We did meet that day. Kind of. No, I mean, what if we were supposed to actually meet? He stared out the window, confused. What are you saying? Ivy sighed, and he could practically hear her rolling her eyes. What if we left something unfinished? What if the universe, or fate, or whatever, is just shoving us together until we figure it out? Grayson snorted. So what? We go on a date and it magically fixes this? Ivy shrugged, her voice light. What do we have to lose? Grayson ran a hand through his hair. A date. With Ivy. He could already see it, her challenging every restaurant choice he made, her making fun of his perfectly ironed shirts, her ordering something ridiculous off the menu just to see how he'd react. He should have said no. Instead, he heard himself say, fine. They met that evening at a small Italian place Ivy picked, one that smelled like garlic and fresh bread, the kind of restaurant Grayson hadn't been to since before his life became a series of business dinners and high-profile engagements. The tablecloths were mismatched, the candles melted into uneven shapes, and the owner greeted Ivy by name when they walked in. Grayson arched an eyebrow. Regular spot? She smirked. When I can afford it. It started off awkward. Grayson wasn't sure if they were supposed to treat this like an experiment or an actual date. Ivy kept fidgeting with her napkin, her usual sharp remarks softened by something almost nervous. He tried to think of something witty, something to break the tension, but instead, they sat in an uncomfortable silence as the waiter took their drink orders. Then, somewhere between the wine arriving and Ivy making an impassioned argument about how the best pizza always came from places with failing health inspection grades, things shifted. The awkwardness faded. She made him laugh. Really laugh. She called him out for the way he always checked his watch, so he took it off and shoved it into his pocket just to see her grin. He made a joke about her stubbornness, and she rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. It felt easy. At some point, he stopped thinking about why they were doing this, stopped analyzing every moment for some cosmic revelation. It was just dinner. Just conversation. Just Ivy, sitting across from him, looking at him like he wasn't a man made of obligations, like he wasn't the product of someone else's carefully laid plans. By the time they left the restaurant, the city felt softer, the night air carrying the hum of late evening laughter from passing strangers. Ivy walked beside him, her arms crossed against the breeze, a thoughtful look on her face. Grayson hesitated, then asked, "Did that feel different to you?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, quietly, "Yeah. Something in his chest tightened. They reached the corner, where they would have to go separate ways, but neither of them moved. Ivy exhaled, shaking her head. This is insane. Grayson smirked. That's the theme of my life lately. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Okay, she murmured, mostly to herself. Just once. Just to see. Grayson barely had time to process what she meant before she stepped closer and kissed him. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't careful. It was like stepping into something that had been waiting for them, like flipping the final piece of a puzzle into place. Something shifted. A shock, not just physical, but deep in his chest, like an invisible thread had just snapped into alignment. He felt her gasp against his lips, felt her grip tighten on his jacket like she had felt it too. By the time they pulled apart, Ivy's eyes were wide, her breathing uneven. Grayson swallowed, his pulse still racing. That was... I know, she whispered. Neither of them moved. Neither of them said anything else. That night, Ivy crawled into bed expecting the usual, drifting into sleep, stepping into some dream where Grayson would be waiting, where their strange, unexplainable connection would continue to stretch between them, unresolved. But when she woke up the next morning, her sheets tangled around her legs, the room still bathed in the gray light of dawn, she realized something. She had slept through the night. And there had been no dreams. Ivy woke up tangled in sheets, the early morning light spilling through her bedroom window. The alarm hadn't gone off yet, and for a moment, she just lay there, trying to place what felt different. Then it hit her. No dreams. She sat up abruptly, heart pounding, scanning the room as if expecting some sign that the universe had changed overnight. Nothing. Just her usual messy nightstand, Leo's school papers sticking out from the corner, a half-empty glass of water that she had knocked over sometime in the night. Her phone buzzed. She didn't have to check to know who it was. Grayson's name glowed on the screen, and she hesitated before picking up. You too? He asked, no greeting, just straight to the point. No dreams, she said, still disoriented. He let out a breath on the other end. So, that was it? She swallowed. Guess so. Silence stretched between them, filled with something that neither of them seemed to know how to name. Meet me later? Grayson asked. I feel like we should talk. She nodded before realizing he couldn't see her. Yeah. Okay. She hung up, but the unease didn't leave. She had expected relief. She had spent months trying to ignore the dreams, push them away, rationalize them. But now that they were gone, it felt like losing something she hadn't realized she wanted to keep. Grayson, on the other hand, had a very different problem. His father sat across from him at breakfast, the morning paper folded neatly beside his plate, a perfectly curated meal spread out in front of them. Eleanor Westcott sipped her tea, watching him over the rim of her cup, while Charles Westcott III spoke without looking up. The board dinner is in 3 weeks. We expect you and Isabella to make the announcement then. Grayson stabbed his eggs with unnecessary force. You expect? His father finally met his gaze. This is not a negotiation, Grayson. His mother sighed, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. Darling, you and Isabella are perfect together. You come from the same world. You understand each other. It just makes sense. Grayson thought about Ivy. Ivy, who made fun of his perfectly pressed suits. Ivy, who rolled her eyes at his privilege but never once treated him like he was just a product of it. Ivy, who smelled like fresh-cut stems and always had a smudge of ink or dirt on her fingers, who had a laugh that made his chest tighten, who had made him feel, maybe for the first time, like he wasn't just walking a life someone else had mapped out for him. And now that the dreams were gone, now that there was no unexplainable force keeping them tied together, he had to face the truth. He didn't want her in his life because of a mystery. He wanted her in his life because he wanted her. He set his fork down, wiping his mouth with his napkin before standing. His father barely blinked. "Where are you going?" Grayson straightened his tie. "To make a choice." Ivy had been pacing the floral shop for the last 30 minutes, talking herself out of whatever ridiculous feelings had taken root in her chest. It was done. The dreams were gone. That was the goal. So why did she feel like something had shifted in a way she couldn't take back? She had always known their worlds didn't fit together. She was a single mom, running a business that barely stayed afloat. He was, him. A man who had probably never had to dig for quarters between couch cushions just to buy a loaf of bread. And yet, she jumped when the bell above the shop door jingled, spinning around to see him standing there. He looked slightly out of breath, like he had been walking fast, like he had been thinking too much. She swallowed. "Hey." He took one step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. "I broke off the engagement," he said, just like that. She stared at him, trying to process the weight of those words. What? "I broke it off," he repeated. "Because I don't love her. Because I never did. Because my parents might be able to tell me how to dress and how to act and what to invest in, but they don't get to decide this." Ivy's heart pounded. "Grayson. I don't want this to be about the dreams," he cut in, voice steady. "I don't want you to think that's the reason I'm here. I'm here because I don't want to go back to a life that's already been written out for me. And if I get to choose where my life goes next, I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you." The words settled in the space between them, heavy and impossible to ignore. She let out a slow breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "Do you know where we're standing?" His brow furrowed. "What?" She swallowed, looking around. "This place. This shop. This is where I was when the dream started. I was standing right here, closing up for the night, when I had the first one." Grayson exhaled. "And I was at a board meeting, trying to pay attention to some deal I didn't care about." She finally met his eyes. "I think we weren't meant to find each other that day at graduation. I think we were meant to find each other now." His lips parted slightly, something unspoken passing between them. "Come with me," she said suddenly. Grayson didn't hesitate. "Where?" She grabbed her coat, slipping her arms through the sleeves. "Where it all started." They drove in comfortable silence, the road leading them back to the community college, to the place where their paths had unknowingly crossed all those years ago. The campus was quieter now, the auditorium empty, the graduation banners long gone. But the weight of what had happened here still lingered. Ivy walked up the steps, turning to face him. "We don't need a mystery to keep us connected." Grayson reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "No," he said, his voice steady. "We don't." And just like that, they chose each other.